Triangulation. The hidden manipulation that turns people against each other. Triangulation is one of those subtle yet incredibly potent manipulation tactics that can slip into our lives almost without notice, quietly reshaping relationships, group dynamics, and even our own self-image. At its core, triangulation occurs when a person deliberately brings a third party into a conflict, conversation, or decision-making process in order to tip the scales of power in their favor. This isn't about healthy mediation or involving an impartial observer to resolve a dispute. It's about altering the emotional atmosphere so that one person maintains control while others are left off balance. The manipulator thrives by keeping the focus away from direct communication and steering it toward comparisons, rivalry, and mistrust. When this happens, the original problem becomes secondary. The emotional instability becomes the real weapon. We see this in toxic romantic relationships when a partner casually drops comments like, "My ex always understood me better," or "Sarah at work really listens to me," knowing full well this will spark insecurity and make their current partner work harder for approval. What's often missed is that triangulation doesn't always look hostile. It can wear the disguise of a compliment to someone else, or an innocent observation, but the emotional undercurrent is intentional, to destabilize and create a hierarchy where the manipulator is at the top. In workplace settings, triangulation might appear as a manager praising one employee in front of another or hinting that John always stays late to finish his work, in a way that pressures others to compete for favor. This creates an atmosphere where trust evaporates, teamwork suffers, and everyone is focused on outperforming their peers instead of collaborating. Families, too, are breeding grounds for this behavior, especially in households with unresolved tension or authoritarian dynamics. A parent might constantly compare siblings. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" which fosters resentment, rivalry, and a deep sense of inadequacy that can persist well into adulthood. One of the reasons triangulation works so effectively is that it hijacks the human need for belonging and approval. By introducing a third party, the manipulator changes the frame of the interaction. Instead of the target focusing on the issue at hand, they're suddenly measuring themselves against someone else, chasing validation, or trying to defend themselves in a suddenly crowded emotional field. From a psychological standpoint, triangulation weaponizes ambiguity. When you don't know where you stand, when the narrative is being filtered through someone else, your brain goes into overdrive trying to piece together missing information. In this heightened state, your emotional reasoning often overrides your logical thinking, making you more susceptible to accepting the manipulator's framing of events. This is why people caught in triangulation often describe feeling like they're walking on eggshells, or that no matter what they do, they can't seem to regain stable footing. The tactic also benefits the manipulator by outsourcing emotional labor. If they can make two people compete or distrust each other, they don't have to resolve the original conflict themselves. Instead, they sit at the center, controlling the flow of information and shaping how each person perceives the other. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes for the targets to recognize the root cause, because the tension feels personal rather than orchestrated. In my view, one of the most insidious aspects of triangulation is how it normalizes indirect communication. Over time, people in these environments stop addressing each other directly and rely on the manipulator as a go-between, which reinforces the manipulator's power and deepens divisions. This is why in toxic workplaces you often see employees reluctant to clarify misunderstandings with each other. They've been conditioned to filter everything through the manager's narrative. Similarly, in families where triangulation is a norm, siblings might carry forward patterns of rivalry into adulthood, even when the manipulative parent is no longer directly involved. Breaking free from triangulation starts with recognizing the pattern and refusing to participate in the game. If someone tries to involve you in a conflict that isn't yours, resist the urge to take sides or accept their framing without verification. If you find yourself being compared to someone else, mentally step back and identify whether this is about genuine feedback or a tactic to provoke insecurity. The antidote to triangulation is direct, transparent communication, even if it feels uncomfortable in the short term. By insisting on addressing issues face to face and keeping discussions between the directly involved parties, you remove the manipulator's leverage. Setting firm boundaries is also critical. This means making it clear that you will not discuss others behind their backs, nor will you entertain comparisons meant to diminish your worth. In my experience, manipulators who rely on triangulation often retreat when they realize they can no longer sow division without being challenged. They may attempt to escalate their tactics at first, but sustained refusal to engage eventually forces them to find other means, or to lose interest altogether. Ultimately, triangulation thrives in environments where secrecy, insecurity, and competition are normalized. It collapses under the weight of openness, mutual respect, and a refusal to play by distorted rules. Whether in love, work, or family, learning to spot triangulation for what it is allows you to reclaim your emotional clarity and rebuild trust with others directly. Once you see the strings being pulled, you not only stop dancing to someone else's tune, you help ensure that the game loses its power entirely. The subtle art of guilt tripping, how emotional manipulation shapes our choices. Guilt tripping is one of those sneaky psychological tools that doesn't come with a flashing warning sign, but can quietly shape how you act, think, and even how you see yourself. At its core, guilt tripping is emotional manipulation dressed up to look like concern, disappointment, or moral reasoning. It works by making someone feel responsible for another person's emotions, creating an invisible leash of obligation that tugs you toward doing what they want. Rather than making a direct request or expressing their needs honestly, the guilt tripper reframes the situation so that denying him feels cold, selfish, or even cruel. The genius, and danger, of this tactic lies in how well it exploits a deeply human need, to be seen as a good person, to maintain harmony, and to avoid being the source of someone else's unhappiness. Imagine a friend who says, "No, it's fine. I'll just go alone," with that pointed sigh, after you decline their last-minute invitation. They could have simply accepted your decision, but instead they plant a seed of guilt, hinting that you're letting him down. This is where guilt tripping thrives, in the gray zone between emotional expression and manipulation. It can appear in romantic relationships where one partner says, "If you really cared about me, you wouldn't need a night out with friends," or in family dynamics where a parent might remark, "I guess you don't love me enough to visit." In the workplace, it's the manager who comments, "I thought you were a team player, but if you can't stay late, I understand," knowing full well that the subtext will push you to reconsider. These statements are not neutral. They are carefully engineered to make you feel like saying, "No," is morally wrong. The most insidious aspect of guilt tripping is how it can gradually reshape your internal compass. Over time, constant exposure can lead you to confuse self-care with selfishness. You start believing that choosing what's best for you is a betrayal of those you care about. This paves the way for chronic people-pleasing, sacrificing your own needs to keep others from feeling disappointed. The manipulator benefits because they get compliance without appearing overtly controlling. You, meanwhile, walk away feeling like you made the right choice, even though it came from pressure rather than free will. I've seen guilt tripping disguised as kindness, like a coworker who says, "Don't worry, I'll handle it," again, in a tone that's less about generosity and more about highlighting your supposed lack of contribution. Or a friend who constantly reminds you of favors they've done, not to celebrate generosity, but to stack an emotional debt you're expected to repay. These moments are traps. They don't just ask for help, they demand it under the threat of moral judgment. Why does guilt tripping work so well? Because it taps into empathy, a quality most people value in themselves. The manipulator plays the role of the wounded party, making you feel that your actions, or lack thereof, are directly harming them. Humans are wired to resolve discomfort in relationships, so the easiest path to restoring peace often seems to be giving in. But what's important to understand is that this peace comes at the expense of your autonomy. Over time, this repeated pattern can lead to burnout, resentment, and even anxiety, because you're living by someone else's emotional scoreboard. Defending yourself against guilt tripping begins with recognizing it for what it is, a form of emotional coercion. The moment you catch that familiar knot in your stomach and hear the voice in your head saying, "I should just do it so they're not upset," pause and evaluate. Are you actually at fault, or are you being nudged into taking on responsibility for something that isn't yours? Remember, Feelings are valid, but they are not always your responsibility to fix. If someone is upset because you set a healthy boundary, that discomfort is theirs to manage. This doesn't mean responding with coldness. You can acknowledge their feelings without accepting guilt. For example, "I understand you're disappointed, but this is the right decision for me," is both compassionate and firm. You don't have to over-explain, justify, or apologize for prioritizing your well-being. Another key defense is to resist keeping a mental favor ledger. People who manipulate with guilt often count every past favor, and if you start playing by those rules, you'll feel permanently indebted. Instead, see acts of kindness as voluntary, not currency. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect and understanding, not on guilt-based transactions. It's also worth noting that not every expression of disappointment is manipulation. Sometimes people are simply sad or frustrated, and that's okay. They're allowed to feel that way. The difference lies in intent and pattern. If the same person consistently reacts to your boundaries with statements that question your care, loyalty, or moral worth, you're likely dealing with a guilt tripper. Self-awareness plays a huge role here. Ask yourself, do I often agree to things I don't want to do just to avoid feeling guilty? Do I leave certain interactions feeling emotionally drained or in debt? Do I find myself explaining my choices more than seems reasonable? If the answer is yes, you may have been caught in this cycle more often than you think. From my perspective, one of the healthiest shifts you can make is reframing how you see no. Saying no is not a rejection of the person. It's a protection of your time, energy, and emotional balance. In fact, boundaries often strengthen relationships because they keep resentment from building. People who respect you will respect your limits, even if they're temporarily disappointed. People who consistently try to bypass your limits through guilt are showing you they value their needs over your well-being. And here's the empowering part. Once you stop feeding into the guilt, the tactic loses its grip. Manipulation thrives on compliance, so the moment you stop rewarding it, the dynamic changes. This might mean enduring some initial pushback, especially from those who are used to getting their way through guilt. But in the long run, you'll gain a stronger sense of self, healthier relationships, and the freedom to make choices based on genuine willingness rather than obligation. Guilt tripping is, at its heart, an attempt to control through emotion rather than reason. It's not always dramatic. It can be as subtle as a sigh, a lingering pause, or a carefully chosen phrase, but the impact is real. It can lead to years of self-doubt and overcompensation if left unchecked. Recognizing it, naming it, and choosing not to engage with it is a skill worth developing. You are not responsible for carrying the emotional load of everyone around you, and your worth is not determined by how much you sacrifice for others. True kindness comes from choice, not coercion, and when you protect your boundaries, you protect your capacity to give authentically. The hidden power of the false consensus effect. How perceived majority opinion shapes our choices. The hidden power of the false consensus effect. How perceived majority opinion shapes our choices. The false consensus effect is one of those subtle yet deeply influential psychological traps that can quietly steer our behavior without us realizing it. And it works by convincing us that a certain opinion, choice, or behavior is what most people believe or do, even when that claim has no solid basis in reality. At its heart, this effect thrives on our deep-rooted need for belonging, for social validation, and for not feeling like the odd one out. Humans are inherently social creatures, and our brains have evolved to avoid rejection because, in ancient times, being excluded from the group often meant losing resources or protection. Today, manipulators, from advertisers to political figures to personal acquaintances, tap into that same evolutionary wiring to push us toward decisions that serve their goals. The manipulation often starts with simple, sweeping statements. Everyone supports this idea, no one disagrees, most people in your situation would do the same. These phrases carry a kind of psychological weight not because they are proven, but because they create an instant perception of a crowd moving in a single direction, and our instincts tell us it's safer to move with that crowd than against it. It's the same principle that makes people clap along at a performance when they see everyone else applauding, even if they didn't enjoy it. In marketing, the false consensus effect is practically a staple tactic. Think of product commercials proudly declaring, 9 out of 10 customers prefer this brand, or online ads boasting, over 1 million sold, without ever showing verifiable evidence. The goal isn't necessarily to inform you. It's to make you feel like you're the only one not buying in, and that subtle discomfort nudges you toward compliance. Social media has amplified this phenomenon to an unprecedented degree. Influencers often deploy phrases like, everyone's obsessed with this, or, you've got to try this trend, to fabricate popularity and push their audiences towards certain products, lifestyles, or beliefs. Politics, too, is rife with this effect, because shaping public opinion often depends less on facts and more on perception. A political leader might announce, the overwhelming majority supports this policy, knowing full well that dissent is higher than they admit, but the statement alone can discourage opposition by making critics feel isolated. Media outlets can reinforce this by selectively presenting only one side of an argument while ignoring or downplaying opposing views, thus creating an artificial sense that there's a single, dominant opinion. The more this false majority narrative is repeated, the more it becomes internalized, and the harder it is for individuals to feel confident challenging it. In workplaces, the false consensus effect can emerge in seemingly harmless ways but with significant consequences. A manipulative manager might say, everyone's agreed to put in extra hours this week, when in reality most employees are unhappy about it, but hearing that statement can pressure individuals into silence for fear of being labeled uncooperative. Group dynamics can make this even more potent. A team leader saying, we've all decided on this plan, positions dissenters as disruptors of unity rather than legitimate contributors with alternative perspectives. This is why, in organizational psychology, fostering an environment where dissent is encouraged is critical to preventing groupthink, which is often fed by the false consensus effect. In personal relationships, the tactic becomes more intimate and more insidious. A controlling partner might tell you, everyone would agree you're overreacting, or, all my exes thought I was the best partner, to make you doubt your feelings and accept their version of reality. Among friends, you might hear, everyone thinks you're being selfish, when in truth, it's just the speaker's own opinion. These statements work not because they're true, but because they exploit your need to maintain social harmony and avoid alienation. The false consensus effect also fuels scams and financial traps. Con artists and high-pressure salespeople often claim, most people in your situation take this deal, or thousands are making money this way, and the implied social proof can override critical thinking, especially when paired with urgency. Multi-level marketing, MLM, recruiters are notorious for saying, everyone is succeeding with this business, glossing over the fact that most participants are losing money. What makes the false consensus effect so powerful is that it doesn't need hard evidence to be effective. Our brains fill in the gaps. We don't stop to demand statistics or proof because the emotional discomfort of being an outlier pushes us to align with the supposed majority. The illusion becomes even harder to resist when we're in environments where information is filtered to reinforce the consensus, whether that's a social media feed curated by algorithms, a news outlet with a clear editorial bias, or a workplace culture that punishes dissent. To defend against it, the first step is awareness. When you hear phrases like, everyone agrees, or, no one would think otherwise, mentally pause and ask yourself, who exactly is everyone? How do I know this claim is accurate? Is there independent evidence beyond what the speaker is saying? This habit of interrogating broad generalizations helps break the automatic acceptance of false consensus. Another strategy is to actively seek diverse perspectives. Make a point of exposing yourself to sources outside your usual bubble, because the more viewpoints you encounter, the less likely you are to believe that one narrative is universally accepted. It's also important to remember that disagreement doesn't make you wrong. It simply means you see things differently. In fact, many major social and scientific breakthroughs happened precisely because individuals resisted the dominant opinion of their time. Being in the minority can be uncomfortable, but it can also be a sign that you're thinking critically. The next time you feel the pull to go along with something just because everyone supposedly supports it, try reframing the situation. If the claim were false, what would the speaker gain from making me believe it's true? Often, the answer reveals the underlying motive. whether it's selling you something, winning your vote, or getting you to comply without protest. The false consensus effect thrives on our unexamined assumptions, but once you start challenging those assumptions, its power fades. You begin to realize that everyone is really everyone, and no one disagrees usually means the people I'm choosing to acknowledge don't disagree. Recognizing that distinction keeps you in control of your choices. Ultimately, the most effective defense is to trust your own judgment while staying open to evidence. Social validation can feel reassuring, but truth and consensus are not the same thing. By grounding your decisions in verifiable facts and a broad range of perspectives, you protect yourself from manipulation and maintain the freedom to think independently. In a world where perceived majority opinion is often manufactured, guarding your mind against the false consensus effect is not just smart. It's essential to living authentically. The hidden power of cognitive dissonance, how our minds trick us into staying wrong. Cognitive dissonance is one of those invisible mental forces that can quietly control a person's choices, even when they're convinced they're thinking freely. It happens when we hold two beliefs, values, or perceptions that contradict each other, which creates an uncomfortable tension inside the mind. Because the human brain is built to seek harmony, it tries to eliminate that discomfort as quickly as possible, not always by finding the truth, but often by bending reality to fit what we already believe. This is why a person who sees themselves as honest, but gets caught in a lie might downplay it as harmless, blame someone else, or even rewrite their own moral rulebook to justify why lying was necessary. The brain isn't trying to be deceitful, it's trying to make the emotional friction disappear. This mechanism, while natural, becomes dangerous when other people deliberately trigger it to steer our decisions. Marketers have mastered this art. They often design ads that subtly challenge your self-image so you feel an itch to correct it through buying their product. A high-end watch brand might imply that true professionals wear their timepiece, creating a mental gap in anyone who sees themselves as successful but doesn't own one. That tension pushes people toward purchase not because the watch is needed, but because it closes the gap between who they believe they are and the image being sold to them. Politics is another arena where cognitive dissonance gets weaponized. Once someone publicly supports a candidate or policy, admitting a mistake feels like losing face, so they double down even when new evidence shows harm. The discomfort of saying, "I was wrong," can be so intense that people instead reinterpret facts, attack the source, or invent new justifications to protect their original stance. This is why you'll often see individuals defend deeply flawed leaders, not out of ignorance, but out of a psychological need to preserve consistency. The effect can be even more sinister in cults and toxic relationships, where contradictions are baked into the dynamic. A cult leader may preach kindness and compassion while enforcing harsh punishments. Followers, instead of calling out the hypocrisy, convince themselves the rules are for their own good. Similarly, a manipulative partner might claim abuse is out of love, forcing the victim to reconcile two incompatible realities. Rather than accept the painful truth, they find mental loopholes that allow both to exist. Over time, this rewiring becomes a trap, making it harder to leave harmful situations. Even outside manipulation, we all experience smaller forms of cognitive dissonance in daily life. A smoker who knows cigarettes are deadly may downplay risks by pointing to a relative who lived to 90 despite smoking, or someone who wastes food despite caring about the environment may tell themselves that one person's habits don't matter in the big picture. In both cases, the goal isn't truth, it's comfort. The human tendency to reduce internal conflict explains why misinformation spreads so easily. If someone has built their identity around a false belief, no amount of factual correction will work unless it also offers a way to preserve their sense of self. This is why arguments on social media rarely change minds. They often strengthen existing positions because people feel personally attacked. Understanding this gives us a powerful insight. The more invested a person is in a choice, whether financially, emotionally, or socially, the harder it becomes for them to abandon it, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. The brain essentially becomes a defense attorney for our past decisions, working tirelessly to build arguments that protect them. To avoid falling into this trap, You have to develop the ability to pause when you feel defensive or resistant to new information and ask, am I rejecting this because it's wrong, or because it challenges my identity? That small act of self-awareness creates space to process discomfort without automatically rewriting reality to fit old beliefs. It also helps to expose yourself to perspectives that challenge your worldview before you're emotionally invested, so you can evaluate them with less bias. On a personal level, embracing the discomfort of being wrong can be transformative. It means seeing mistakes as updates, not failures, like software patches for the mind. The irony is that once you become comfortable with inconsistency, you actually make more consistent, reality-based decisions because you're no longer chained to defending past errors. Cognitive dissonance will never disappear, it's part of how the mind works, but by recognizing its pull, you can choose whether to let it manipulate you or use it as a signal to re-examine your assumptions. The moment you stop fearing the phrase, "I might have been wrong," is the moment cognitive dissonance stops being a mental cage and starts becoming a tool for growth. In a world full of political spin, advertising tricks, and emotional pressure, that skill is not just valuable, it's freedom itself. Planned vulnerability, the subtle art of using fake openness to gain power. Planned vulnerability is one of those psychological strategies that sounds harmless on the surface, but becomes unsettling once you understand how it works. It is not about the natural, organic sharing that happens when two people grow closer over time. Instead, it is about calculated self-disclosure, a deliberate decision to reveal just enough weakness or personal struggle at carefully chosen moments to create trust, emotional closeness, and, ultimately, leverage over another person. At its core, this tactic hijacks a very human instinct, our deep-seated tendency toward reciprocity, and weaponizes it. Humans are social creatures. When someone opens up about a personal hardship, we are wired to respond with empathy, understanding, and often our own personal disclosures. This is the glue that holds many relationships together. However, in the hands of a manipulator, that glue becomes a trap. The manipulator chooses the timing, the details, and even the emotional tone of the vulnerability, so that it serves their agenda. They might appear shaken, teary, or unusually raw, not because they are truly inviting connection, but because they know that this performance will lower your guard. The goal is simple. Once you are emotionally invested, you are easier to influence, more likely to trust, and less likely to challenge them. Romantic manipulation is one of the most familiar arenas for planned vulnerability. In the early stages of a relationship, a toxic partner might suddenly reveal a heartbreaking story, a devastating betrayal, a traumatic childhood, or a failed past relationship that supposedly left deep emotional scars. This disclosure often comes surprisingly soon, before genuine trust has had time to develop naturally. The effect is powerful. The other person feels chosen, special, almost honored to be entrusted with such private pain. But behind this intimacy lies strategy. By appearing wounded, the manipulator creates an instant emotional hook, and from that point forward, they can use their fragile state as a shield against criticism or as justification for unhealthy behavior. "You know what I've been through," they might say, when confronted about disrespect or controlling tendencies, making the victim feel guilty for even bringing it up. Planned vulnerability thrives in the workplace too, where the lines between professional and personal obligations are often blurred. Imagine a boss who sighs heavily in a meeting and says, "I'm under so much pressure from upper management, I'm not sure how I can keep this team afloat." On the surface, this sounds like a leader confiding in their team. In reality, it often plants a seed of obligation. Employees feel guilty for setting limits, take on extra work without complaint, and protect the boss from scrutiny. The same dynamic can appear between colleagues. A coworker might constantly talk about being overwhelmed, or barely holding it together, subtly pushing others to cover for them, all while maintaining a sympathetic image. Outside of workplaces and romantic circles, planned vulnerability is a powerful sales and persuasion tool. Con artists and salespeople understand that trust sells. A scammer might admit, "I've made mistakes in the past, but I've finally found a system that works, and I'd never lead you astray." By framing themselves as someone who has failed and learned hard lessons, They seem more relatable and less threatening. This calculated humility makes their pitch feel authentic, lowering skepticism and resistance. Politicians and public figures use similar methods on a grand scale, revealing selective personal struggles in speeches or interviews to soften their image. A leader who appears to have struggled like the average citizen is more easily forgiven for missteps, because people feel a shared sense of humanity. Friendships are not immune either. In social groups, a manipulative person might position themselves as the wounded member, the one who has endured endless hardship, needs constant protection, and must be treated gently. While some of their struggles might be genuine, they are often exaggerated or selectively framed to ensure they always receive attention, special privileges, or immunity from criticism. Over time, the group begins to feel responsible for this person's happiness, and questioning their actions becomes taboo. The darker side of planned vulnerability is its ability to create emotional debt. Emotional debt is not financial, but it feels just as binding. When someone shares a deeply personal hardship with you, especially in a way that makes them seem fragile, you feel a psychological pull to be supportive, to protect them, or to be there for them no matter what. In healthy relationships, this is mutual and unforced. But in manipulative dynamics, it becomes one-sided. The target starts to feel guilty for setting boundaries, saying no, or even taking care of their own needs, because they've been conditioned to prioritize the manipulator's emotional state. Breaking free becomes difficult, not because the victim doesn't see the problem, but because they fear the emotional consequences of pulling away. Recognizing planned vulnerability requires paying close attention to patterns rather than isolated incidents. Everyone has moments of genuine openness, and those should be met with compassion. The difference lies in timing, frequency, and context. Manipulative vulnerability often appears early in relationships, at moments when the manipulator needs something, or right before they make a request. It's rarely random. It's strategically placed to disarm you. Ask yourself, does this person always share personal struggles when they need my help, resources, or loyalty? Do I feel emotionally pressured after they open up? Do I feel like I owe them something as a result of the disclosure? These are warning signs that what you're witnessing is not authentic connection but staged intimacy. Defending yourself against planned vulnerability doesn't mean becoming cold or unfeeling. The key is to separate compassion from obligation. You can care about someone's hardship without automatically sacrificing your own boundaries or judgment. Offering a listening ear does not require offering blind loyalty. One practical approach is to slow down your emotional response. When someone shares something deeply personal, resist the urge to respond with immediate promises or actions. Give yourself space to process. This disrupts the manipulator's goal of catching you in the emotional heat of the moment. Another safeguard is to look for reciprocity in the relationship. Genuine vulnerability is mutual and balanced over time. Manipulative vulnerability often flows one way, with you as the constant listener and giver. In the end, understanding planned vulnerability is about reclaiming your ability to respond to emotional disclosures on your own terms. The instinct to help is a beautiful human trait, but it becomes dangerous when exploited. By being mindful of patterns, questioning timing, and keeping your boundaries intact, you can protect yourself from being drawn into emotional debts you never agreed to take on. Planned vulnerability is persuasive because it feels real. But once you learn to recognize the difference between authentic sharing and strategic self-exposure, you take back the power to decide how close, and how much, you let someone in. The power play of twisted words. How manipulators rewrite your reality. The power of words lies not just in what is spoken, but in how they are interpreted, and few tactics are as insidious as the deliberate twisting of those words to serve someone else's agenda. This strategy, which I call the power play of twisted words, is a psychological manipulation technique that works by intentionally reframing your statements, ideas, or intentions in a way that makes you look unreasonable, guilty, or even foolish. The aim is simple: derail the conversation, shift the focus away from the real issue, and force you into a defensive position where you are constantly clarifying and justifying yourself. While the surface-level interaction may seem like a misunderstanding, this is no accident. It is a calculated move designed to control the narrative. We have to remember that the human brain is hardwired to correct mistakes and misunderstandings. When someone claims we said something we didn't, we instinctively rush to explain ourselves. This is exactly what the manipulator counts on. By constantly misrepresenting your statements, they create an endless loop of defense and explanation, draining your energy and preventing any productive dialogue. You might enter a conversation with a clear point to discuss, but after a few strategic distortions, you're no longer talking about your original idea, you're stuck explaining what you really meant. I've seen this tactic play out in countless scenarios. In personal arguments, for instance, a person might take a perfectly reasonable suggestion, such as, "I think we should be more mindful of our spending this year," and twist it into a personal attack. "Oh, so you think I'm irresponsible?" Suddenly, you're defending your respect for their financial habits rather than discussing the actual budget. The manipulator wins because the focus has shifted entirely. In politics, this tactic is practically an art form. A politician might make a policy suggestion like, "We need more oversight in certain industries," and opponents will warp it into, "They want to destroy businesses and put people out of work." The distortion is so effective because it triggers emotional reactions in the public, which often overshadow nuanced discussion. The media, too, uses this deliberately in the form of sensationalized headlines that misinterpret statements to provoke outrage. The goal is engagement, not truth, and once the public's emotional energy is hooked, actual facts take a backseat. In toxic relationships, deliberate misinterpretation often becomes a tool of gaslighting. You might say something entirely neutral, "I need some time alone to recharge," and it comes back as, "So you don't love me anymore?" Or, "You're just looking for an excuse to ignore me." Over time, repeated distortions like this can erode a person's confidence in their own communication, making them hesitant to speak at all. It's not just about guilt, it's about making you feel like your own words will always be used against you. This tactic is equally prevalent in workplaces, where power dynamics make it especially dangerous. An employee who requests clearer deadlines might hear back, "You just don't want to work hard," or "You're being difficult." A colleague might twist an innocent comment into something offensive to undermine your reputation. Once the seed of doubt is planted in others' minds, the damage is done, regardless of the truth. Even in legal and interrogation settings, this manipulation is strategic. Lawyers might seize on a minor inconsistency in a witness's testimony and exaggerate it to make them seem unreliable. Police interrogators sometimes intentionally reframe answers to pressure suspects into clarifying, and in doing so, they may inadvertently admit to something they never intended. It's a high-stakes game of verbal chess, where the manipulator uses your own instinct to set the record straight as their opening move. But why does this tactic work so consistently across so many domains? The answer lies in a combination of psychology and social norms. People value accuracy in communication. When someone says we're wrong, we want to prove we're right. We also fear being misunderstood because it can harm our relationships, reputations, and credibility. Manipulators exploit this fear, knowing that most of us are uncomfortable letting a false version of our words stand unchallenged. The irony is that by engaging in repeated clarifications, we're playing into their strategy, not defending ourselves effectively. So how do you protect yourself from the power play of twisted words? The first step is recognizing the tactic. Pay attention to patterns. If you find yourself repeatedly having to defend what you really meant with a particular person, it's possible they're doing this intentionally. The second step is to refuse to be drawn into endless justification. If someone misrepresents your statement, clarify it once, calmly and directly, then bring the conversation back to the original point. "That's not what I said. Let's focus on what I meant." By not over-explaining, you avoid feeding the distortion loop. Another powerful defense is emotional detachment. Manipulators thrive when you become frustrated or flustered, because it makes it easier for them to portray you as irrational or defensive. By staying calm, you deny them that leverage. In some cases, especially in professional or public contexts, it may be necessary to document conversations so that your words cannot be easily distorted. Written communication, while not immune to manipulation, at least provides a record you can refer back to when needed. It's also worth noting that sometimes misinterpretation is not deliberate. It can result from poor listening skills, cultural differences, or emotional sensitivity. The key is to distinguish between occasional misunderstandings and a pattern of consistent distortion that serves to discredit you. The former calls for patience and clearer communication. The latter calls for boundaries and self-protection. In the end, the power play of twisted words is about control. By redefining what you say, manipulators attempt to redefine reality itself, at least within the scope of that interaction. The cost is not just the frustration of being misunderstood, but the erosion of trust, the derailment of meaningful conversations, and in some cases, the rewriting of your public or personal reputation. Recognizing the tactic for what it is removes much of its power. It shifts the dynamic from reactive defense to proactive control. You get to decide what your words mean, not them. And when you stop playing the game they've set up, when you decline the bait of endless clarification, you take the first step toward reclaiming your voice, your narrative, and your peace of mind. Pacing and leading, the subtle art of mirroring to influence minds. Pacing and leading is one of those psychological tactics that sounds harmless when described in theory, yet its real-world applications range from empowering encouragement to subtle manipulation that can steer entire decisions without the target ever realizing it. At its core, the method starts with pacing, which is essentially aligning yourself with another person's current emotional state, speech rhythm, or worldview. This is not simply nodding along, but actively mirroring their patterns so that they feel a sense of resonance, as if you are both operating on the same wavelength. The human brain is wired to find comfort in familiarity. We instinctively warm to those who seem to share our experiences and understand our emotions. Once this rapport is established, the leader subtly shifts into the second stage, leading, where they begin to direct the conversation, mood, or behavior toward a chosen outcome. What makes this strategy so effective is that the transition from pacing to leading is often imperceptible. For example, in a sales environment, a representative might begin by empathizing with a potential buyer's hesitation, acknowledging that big decisions require careful thought, and agreeing wholeheartedly. That's the pacing. Then, without breaking the emotional connection, they pivot to the leading phase by framing a limited time offer as the perfect way to lock in peace of mind, while still taking the time to decide. The buyer, feeling validated, is far less likely to resist. But sales are only one arena where this operates. Politicians and activists often deploy pacing and leading in speeches, starting by voicing the frustrations of their audience, using familiar language and grievances, and then channeling that energy toward rallying support for a cause or candidate. When used skillfully, this makes a directive feel like a natural extension of shared understanding, rather than an external imposition. In relationships, the line between genuine bonding and manipulation becomes thinner. A partner who mirrors your values, daily habits, or emotional struggles can seem like the ultimate soulmate, but when that closeness is leveraged to introduce controlling behaviors, such as pushing for shared passwords under the guise of trust, the pacing has quietly morphed into leading you toward diminished privacy. Therapists and hypnotists also apply pacing and leading, though ideally for positive purposes. In hypnotherapy, pacing might involve pointing out obvious, undeniable truths like, "You're sitting comfortably in this chair," or "You're breathing naturally." These statements create subconscious agreement, which makes the mind more receptive to the leading suggestions that follow, such as you relax, you may feel lighter. In business leadership, a manager might acknowledge the stress of a high-pressure project, pacing their team's fatigue, and then channel that alignment into a rallying call to push through the final stretch. In each of these examples, the common thread is that pacing acts like a handshake, establishing trust, while leading is the subtle tug in the direction the influencer wants you to go. The ethical dimension is where things get interesting. Used responsibly, pacing and leading can help guide someone through fear, indecision, or anxiety toward constructive action. A mentor could pace a struggling student's frustrations before introducing strategies to improve their confidence. But when used with hidden agendas, it becomes a tool for covert control, exploiting the target's trust. Part of the power here lies in how naturally it fits into normal conversation. There's no overt push or obvious pressure, just a gradual redirection that feels collaborative. The danger is that because it feels so organic, the person being led rarely questions the process. In fact, many people can't pinpoint the moment when the interaction shifted from mutual understanding to strategic persuasion. This is why awareness is critical. Spotting pacing and leading requires noticing patterns. Is someone consistently mirroring your tone, word choice, or emotional intensity? Do they align with your frustrations only to then propose a next step that serves their own agenda? Are they echoing your values and experiences right before suggesting a significant change or decision? If the answer is yes, it's worth pausing to ask yourself whether you are truly choosing freely or simply following a path that has been subtly constructed for you. One of the most insidious elements of pacing and leading is that it can masquerade as empathy. We are social creatures who crave understanding, and manipulators know that the fastest way to bypass resistance is to make us feel seen and heard. Once our defenses are lowered, leading becomes almost effortless for them. The best defense is developing the mental habit of stepping back when you notice strategic agreement, especially if the agreement is followed by a suggestion that requires action or commitment. In doing so, you create space to evaluate not just the content of the suggestion, but the process by which it arrived. If the leading serves mutual benefit and you are aware of it, the technique can be harmless or even helpful. But if it's being used to nudge you towards something you wouldn't have chosen independently, that's a red flag. Ultimately, pacing and leading is neither inherently good nor bad. It is a communication tool with the potential for both authentic connection and manipulative exploitation. Its power lies in its subtlety, and its danger lies in our tendency to trust those who seem like us. Recognizing when you're being paced is the first step in deciding whether to allow yourself to be led, or whether to take back control of the direction altogether. False equivalence, the subtle manipulation that distorts reality. False equivalence is one of the most deceptively simple yet psychologically powerful tools in the manipulator's arsenal. At first glance, it looks like an appeal to fairness or balance. Two sides are placed side by side, dressed up in similar language, and presented as if they were equally valid, equally flawed, or equally extreme. But under the surface, something far more dangerous is happening. Facts are being flattened, context is being erased, and moral weight is being redistributed in ways that favor the manipulator. This tactic thrives in environments where people are overloaded with information, anxious about appearing biased, or socially pressured to see both sides. Humans have an innate desire for symmetry. We instinctively lean toward compromise because it feels rational and even-handed. The trouble is, when the two sides of an argument are fundamentally different in scale, context, and impact, treating them as equals isn't fair, it's misleading. Consider the political arena, where a leader embroiled in a corruption scandal might deflect by saying, "Well, my opponent isn't perfect either." While technically true, nobody is perfect. The statement deliberately equates serious corruption with unrelated or minor shortcomings. The result? Public focus shifts from accountability to false balance, and the scandal becomes just another "he said, she said" narrative. This pattern repeats in discussions of social justice. Someone pointing out systemic racism might be met with, "Discrimination exists on both sides." Here, deeply entrenched and historically reinforced oppression is placed on the same level as sporadic, isolated incidents. The comparison erases context and scale, making the larger injustice seem less urgent. The media, often in its pursuit of neutrality, unintentionally becomes a stage for false equivalence. In televised debates about climate change, for example, a panel might feature a climate scientist with decades of research alongside an outspoken denier with no relevant credentials. To the casual viewer, it appears as if both positions carry equal merit, when in truth, one is grounded in evidence and the other in misinformation or ideological bias. The danger here is that false equivalence doesn't just blur the truth, it can slow down or even reverse progress on critical issues. In personal relationships, false equivalence takes on an even more insidious form. Imagine a partner caught cheating saying, "Well, You forgot our anniversary once, so we're even. The emotional weight, intent, and consequences of infidelity are vastly different from forgetting a date, but by framing them as comparable mistakes, the manipulator pressures the other person into guilt and premature forgiveness. In friendships, this might sound like, "You didn't reply to my text, so it's no big deal I skipped your important event." The surface logic masks a deeper imbalance. One action is a small social slip. The other is a major breach of support. In workplaces, false equivalence is often weaponized to normalize or excuse unethical behavior. A company caught cutting corners on safety might shrug it off by saying, "All businesses cut costs." This conflates ordinary efficiency with dangerous negligence, erasing the moral and legal distinctions between them. Employees raising concerns about toxic management might be told, "Everyone gets stressed at work," equating manageable job pressure with sustained emotional abuse. The same principle plays out online. If someone criticizes a harmful ideology, a deflector might reply, "Both sides have extremists." While this may contain a sliver of truth, it strips away critical details, the proportion of extremists, the severity of their actions, and the systemic impact of their ideology. The end result is an intellectual stalemate in which harmful beliefs are shielded from legitimate scrutiny. To understand why false equivalence works so well, we have to acknowledge two cognitive tendencies: our aversion to conflict and our preference for symmetry. When presented with two opposing viewpoints, we're wired to think there must be some validity on each side. This is the fallacy of the middle ground, the belief that truth always lies somewhere between extremes. But in reality, sometimes one side is overwhelmingly supported by evidence, while the other exists purely to muddy the waters. Defending against false equivalence requires active resistance to that pull toward balance for balance's sake. Ask yourself, are these situations truly comparable in scale, intent, and impact? Do they carry the same moral or practical weight? What is gained, and more importantly, what is lost, when we pretend they're equal? For example, imagine a debate about public health measures during a pandemic. One side supports evidence-based strategies to save lives, while the other promotes unverified and harmful cures. Treating both as equally valid doesn't foster open dialogue. It endangers people. A key insight here is that false equivalence isn't just a rhetorical mistake. It's a deliberate strategic choice when used manipulatively. It allows those in the wrong to drag their critics down to their level, forcing a kind of moral parity that shields them from consequences. The tactic exploits a social reflex to avoid being one-sided, especially in settings where being perceived as biased carries reputational costs. There's also a subtler danger. When false equivalence becomes a habit in public discourse, it erodes our collective ability to distinguish between degrees of harm. This erosion leads to a moral flattening where extreme injustice and minor inconvenience are discussed as if they belong in the same category. Once that flattening takes root, meaningful action becomes harder, because if everything is equally bad, then nothing is urgent. Breaking the cycle starts with calling out the imbalance. That might mean pointing out the difference in consequences. Forgetting a date didn't break our trust, but lying to me did, highlighting context. This bias is systemic, not isolated, or refusing to engage in a staged debate where one side lacks credibility. It also means being willing to take a stand without feeling compelled to hand equal space to misinformation. In other words, rejecting false equivalence isn't about silencing dissent. It's about ensuring that discussion happens on a foundation of proportionality and truth. Ultimately, resisting this manipulation is about protecting clarity. Fairness doesn't mean treating all claims as equal. It means evaluating them on their merits and consequences. That requires courage, because manipulators will accuse you of bias or intolerance when you refuse to play their balancing game. But the alternative is far worse. A world where truth is permanently blurred, accountability is always negotiable, and reality is whatever sounds the most even. Recognizing false equivalence is the first step toward making sure your decisions, and the collective decisions of society, are guided by accuracy, context, and genuine fairness, rather than a seductive but destructive illusion of balance. The mirror effect. How subtle imitation shapes trust. influence, and human connection. The mirror effect is one of the most fascinating and often underestimated tools in human interaction, a subtle yet potent method for creating rapport, shaping perception, and influencing decisions without the other person ever realizing what's happening. At its essence, it is the deliberate act of reflecting another person's posture, gestures, speaking rhythm, tone, or even emotional energy in a way that triggers a deep, instinctive sense of familiarity. Humans are drawn to what feels familiar, and when we encounter someone who seems to move like us, or feel like us, our subconscious often interprets that as a signal of trustworthiness and similarity. This reaction is not accidental. It's the result of thousands of years of evolutionary programming. From early childhood, we mimic others as a way to bond and learn. Babies mirror the smiles and frowns of their parents, groups of friends slowly adopt each other's mannerisms, and romantic partners often develop similar speech habits over time. Modern neuroscience has shown that our brains contain mirror neurons that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else doing the same thing, which explains why watching someone smile can make us feel warmer, or why seeing someone's excitement can spark our own. When applied with intent, mirroring can transform social dynamics. It can make others feel more at ease, more understood, and more inclined to agree with or support our ideas. One of the most accessible uses of this technique is in body language, leaning forward a moment after the other person does, adopting a similar sitting position, or integrating subtle echoes of their hand gestures into your own responses. The trick is subtlety. Obvious or exaggerated imitation feels artificial and can trigger suspicion instead of trust. The same principle extends to verbal communication. If someone speaks slowly and deliberately, matching their pacing can make the conversation feel more comfortable. If they favor casual slang or formal expressions, aligning your tone helps bridge the social gap. Even incorporating similar phrases can unconsciously deepen the bond. Beyond physical and verbal imitation, emotional mirroring can be especially powerful. If someone shares an exciting personal victory, responding with matching enthusiasm validates their feelings and strengthens your connection. If they express sadness or frustration, acknowledging and reflecting their mood, rather than trying to force positivity, can make them feel seen and understood. This capacity to align emotionally is one reason why therapists, skilled negotiators, and experienced sales professionals often use mirroring to build trust and guide conversations toward desired outcomes. In high-stakes negotiations, for example, subtly matching the opponent's body posture or speech rhythm can lower their guard and make them more open to collaboration. In everyday life, mirroring accelerates bonding, making it invaluable in networking, dating, teamwork, and conflict resolution. But like many psychological tools, the mirror effect carries a darker side. Skilled manipulators, con artists, and certain political figures weaponize mirroring to create an artificial sense of intimacy, making their targets feel as though they've found someone who truly understands them, only to exploit that trust later. They may reflect not just gestures and tone, but also claimed interests, opinions, and emotional states to craft a version of themselves that seems perfectly aligned with the other person's identity. This is why awareness is crucial. When someone mirrors you with uncanny precision and speed, or shifts their personality dramatically depending on who they're talking to, it's worth questioning the authenticity of the interaction. Recognizing the technique doesn't mean rejecting it outright. When used ethically, mirroring is a remarkably effective way to enhance communication, resolve misunderstandings, and create stronger, more authentic bonds. It's about meeting people where they are rather than forcing them to meet you where you stand. By consciously adjusting your approach to match someone's energy, rhythm, and perspective, you can foster trust without manipulation. For example, in a tense business meeting, mirroring the calm and measured demeanor of a key decision maker can help diffuse tension and keep the conversation productive. In a personal disagreement, reflecting the other person's emotional intensity, without escalating it, can signal empathy and open the door to resolution. The beauty of the mirror effect lies in its adaptability. It can be as simple as aligning your breathing with a conversation partner's during a quiet discussion, or as nuanced as matching the micro-expressions on someone's face during a delicate emotional exchange. However, Mastery requires self-awareness and restraint. Mirroring should always feel organic, never forced. Overuse can come across as mimicry, while misuse risks damaging trust rather than building it. The most skillful practitioners blend mirroring so seamlessly into their interactions that it feels like a natural rhythm rather than a calculated tactic. This is also why the technique works best when paired with genuine curiosity and respect for the other person's perspective. Without authenticity, mirroring becomes hollow, a facade that eventually cracks. As social creatures, we all crave connection, and mirroring taps into one of the deepest layers of that craving, the need to feel understood on an unspoken level. Whether in professional negotiations, romantic encounters, or casual conversations, the ability to subtly reflect another's behavior and emotional state can make you more persuasive, more likable, and more effective in shaping outcomes. But perhaps the most important insight is that the mirror effect is not just about changing how others see you. It's about shifting the entire dynamic of an interaction so that trust, cooperation, and understanding naturally emerge. In a world where many forms of influence are overt, aggressive, or transactional, mirroring stands out as a gentle, almost invisible force, one that can strengthen relationships and open doors without anyone feeling pushed. Like any powerful tool, its true impact depends entirely on the intent behind it. Used with empathy and integrity, it can enrich both sides of a connection. Used with deceit, it can undermine the very trust it seems to build. And in that distinction lies the real mastery of the mirror effect. Not just knowing how to do it, but knowing why, when, and for whose benefit you choose to employ it. Repetition hypnosis. How repeated messages rewire your mind. If we extend the repetition hypnosis scenario further, the picture becomes even more unsettling when you consider how seamlessly it operates in the background of everyday life. What makes this tactic so potent is that it rarely feels like manipulation in the moment. It feels familiar, comfortable, even self-generated. Once an idea has been repeated enough, your brain no longer treats it as external input, but rather as part of your own mental landscape. This is why you might find yourself defending a belief you never consciously decided to adopt, or quoting phrases you never truly examined for truth. The repetition doesn't just lodge the message in memory, it erodes the mental boundaries between your original thinking and what has been fed to you. Consider the phenomenon of earworms, those songs that loop in your head long after you've stopped listening. Advertisers and propagandists use the same principle, but with ideas instead of melodies. A political slogan, a product tagline, or even a social stereotype can play on a mental loop for years after its initial exposure, guiding your judgments and choices long after the original context has faded. This is particularly dangerous when the repeated message isn't factual but emotionally charged, because emotions anchor memories more deeply than logic ever could. You might not remember the source of a claim, but you'll remember the way it made you feel, and feelings are far harder to fact-check than facts. One of the subtler aspects of repetition hypnosis is that it doesn't require the repeated statement to be identical. Slight variations in wording, tone, or framing can make the brain process it as fresh input, while still reinforcing the same underlying concept. This is why a manipulator might rephrase the same insult or the same persuasive point in multiple ways. You're too sensitive, you overreact to everything, you can't take a joke. The target feels as if they're encountering a series of independent observations, when in reality it's one narrative being drilled into them from multiple angles. Modern technology supercharges this process. In the past, a person might hear a piece of propaganda a few times a week in speeches or newspapers. Today, thanks to social media algorithms, that same message can be encountered dozens of times a day across different accounts, pages, and influences. Even if you think you're consuming diverse content, behind the scenes, platforms are reinforcing the same themes because their algorithms prioritize familiarity. The danger is that this isn't just persuasion anymore, it's conditioning. The sheer volume of repetition creates a sense of inevitability. If so many different sources are saying the same thing, it must be true. In some cases, repetition hypnosis is combined with isolation to devastating effect. Cults and extremist groups often limit members' access to alternative viewpoints, ensuring that the only voices they hear are those echoing the same ideology. This magnifies the power of repetition, because without competing narratives, the repeated message doesn't just seem plausible, it becomes reality. The same mechanism can be seen in abusive households, where the victim's social circle is slowly cut down until the only opinions they hear are the abuser's. Over time, resistance doesn't just weaken, it feels illogical, as if the victim is betraying something everyone agrees on. Breaking free from repetition hypnosis is challenging because it requires both awareness and discomfort. The first step is noticing patterns in what you hear, read, and watch, not just the content, but the frequency. If you find yourself thinking about an idea far more than others, ask whether that's due to its merit or its repetition. The second step is actively seeking exposure to different perspectives, even if they initially feel wrong or strange. That discomfort is often the sign that you're encountering something outside your usual conditioning. It's also worth noting that repetition can be used for good. Habits, affirmations, and learning all rely on it. The difference lies in intention and transparency. If you're aware of the repetition and choose to engage with it, like daily exercise reminders or studying a language, you're in control. When repetition is hidden, manipulative, and emotionally charged, that's when it becomes hypnosis in the truest sense, a slow rewiring of thought without consent. Ultimately, the defense against repetition hypnosis is not to avoid repetition entirely, which is impossible, but to become conscious of it. Recognize when a message feels true, because it's familiar rather than because it's been tested. Learn to pause before acting on thoughts that seem to naturally arise, and ask yourself whose voice you might actually be repeating. Awareness doesn't break the spell overnight, but it loosens its hold, allowing you to reassert ownership over your own mind. And in a world where repetition is constant, that awareness might be the only thing standing between you and someone else's carefully planted narrative. Priming, the hidden triggers that control your decisions. Priming is one of those psychological levers that works quietly, almost invisibly, shaping what we think, feel, and choose, often without us realizing it's happening. At its core, priming happens when exposure to a word, image, sound, or even an atmosphere subtly nudges our brain toward a particular thought or reaction. Imagine it as someone planting a seed in your subconscious. Later, when the right situation arises, that seed sprouts in the form of a decision, preference, or judgment you feel is entirely your own. What makes priming so powerful is that it bypasses our conscious guardrails. The brain is a pattern-making machine. It links ideas together faster than we can track, so even a fleeting cue can influence what comes next. You might see a beach scene in an ad, and hours later find yourself craving a tropical drink without ever connecting the dots. In marketing, this is no accident. High-end boutiques might fill the air with the scent of leather or play soft classical music, quietly whispering to your subconscious that what you're about to buy is refined, sophisticated, worth the price tag. Meanwhile, fast food chains blast bright reds and yellows because those colors subconsciously spark hunger and urgency. Supermarkets go even further, pairing background music with strategic product placement, expensive items at eye level, comfort scents like fresh bread wafting from the bakery, to prime you into spending more without any hard sell. In politics, priming is just as calculated. Media outlets and campaign strategists know that certain words shape perceptions before facts are even discussed. Call a leader decisive, and you prime the public to interpret their actions as strong. Call them reckless, and every move suddenly looks dangerous. Symbols, slogans, and repeated imagery are all part of this game. They load the mental dice before the conversation even begins. On a personal level, priming can be far more intimate and manipulative. A coworker might, casually, tell you how difficult another team member is before you've ever met them, subtly biasing your judgment. A partner asking for help might start with, "You've always been such a generous person," priming you to act in a way that matches that identity. Even our own self-image can be influenced this way. Studies show that when people are repeatedly exposed to words associated with intelligence, they perform better on problem-solving tasks, while those exposed to words linked to laziness or failure unconsciously underperform, living down to the negative expectation. Priming isn't inherently evil. It can be used for good. Educators might prime students for confidence before a big test, or therapists might prime clients for resilience before discussing difficult topics. But in the wrong hands, it becomes a subtle weapon. Cults, extremist groups, and controlling relationships often rely on repeated priming to reshape how followers see the world, filtering reality so that opposing ideas feel alien or threatening. Online, algorithms act like relentless primers, feeding you similar posts and videos over and over until certain viewpoints feel like the norm, whether or not they reflect reality. The most dangerous part is how effortless it feels. Primed thoughts don't come with a warning label. To defend yourself, you need to notice the setup before the punchline. Ask yourself, am I leaning this way because I truly believe it, or because something planted the idea earlier? This means questioning not only the content you consume, but also the timing and repetition of it. Vary your information sources, step outside your usual circles, and pay attention to the background noise in environments, music, scents, images that might be steering your mood or choices. Once you spot priming in action, it loses much of its grip, because awareness breaks the automatic chain between cue and reaction. The truth is, priming is everywhere, and pretending we're immune only makes us more vulnerable. The real power lies in using it consciously, to strengthen healthy habits, open our minds, and make decisions that reflect our genuine values rather than the invisible fingerprints of someone else's agenda. The hidden pull of the Zynic effect: why unfinished business controls your mind. The Zynic effect, named after Russian psychologist Bluma Zygarnik, is more than a quirky observation about memory. It's a deep insight into how our brains are wired to chase completion. At its core, the phenomenon explains why unfinished tasks, unresolved questions, or incomplete emotional exchanges tend to stick in our minds far more stubbornly than the ones we've neatly wrapped up. When something is left hanging, our brain treats it as an open loop, generating a persistent sense of cognitive tension, a sort of mental itch that won't go away until it's scratched. This is not a mild curiosity. It's a neurological drive toward closure, and once you notice it, you'll see it everywhere. Think of the last time you watched a TV series that ended an episode on a cliffhanger. A main character disappears, a shocking revelation drops, or a key mystery is hinted at but not explained. Even after the credits rolled, your brain kept playing with the possibilities, trying to connect dots that weren't given to you. That lingering tension is the Zynic effect in action, pulling you back for just one more episode. And in today's streaming culture, this is one of the main reasons binge-watching feels almost involuntary. The same mechanism applies outside of entertainment, in work, creativity, marketing, even relationships. Many people find it hard to start working on a project because they feel overwhelmed by its size or complexity. Yet, interestingly, the hardest part is often not the work itself, but crossing the threshold into starting. Once you take that first small step, opening the document, sketching an outline, making the first call, the Zynic effect quietly takes over. Your brain now knows there's something unfinished, and it subtly nudges you to return and complete it. Some writers even use this deliberately by stopping mid-sentence instead of finishing a paragraph. That way, when they come back the next day, they're not staring at a cold blank page, they're picking up a live thread their brain is still holding onto. Marketers and advertisers have mastered this phenomenon, often without explicitly naming it. A headline like, "The one habit that could change your life," but nobody talks about it, or, "You won't believe what happened next," creates an open mental loop. Even if you know it's clickbait, part of your mind still feels the need to close the loop by clicking. The same is true with limited time offers that end with, "Find out more inside," or, "Details at checkout." It's not just urgency they're exploiting, it's the discomfort of the incomplete. On a more personal level, the Zynic effect explains why unresolved arguments or unfinished conversations can replay in your head for days, weeks, sometimes years. When we leave an emotional exchange without closure, be it a fight with a friend, a breakup without explanation, or even a meeting that ended abruptly, our brain doesn't file it away as done. Instead, it replays fragments, imagines alternative outcomes, and continually searches for resolution. This loop can be exhausting, especially for people who already struggle with anxiety or perfectionism, because the mental system designed to help us finish tasks can backfire into constant rumination. The darker side of the Zynic effect is that it doesn't distinguish between helpful persistence and harmful obsession. In the context of perfectionism, a person may feel they can never truly finish something because it can always be improved. That keeps the mental loop open indefinitely, leading to stress and burnout. Similarly, intrusive thoughts, those unwanted mental images or fears that seem to pop up without invitation, often persist because the brain treats them like unresolved problems that must be revisited. Therapies such as cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, often aim to break these loops, either by reframing the situation so the brain perceives it as resolved, or by helping the individual tolerate the discomfort of incompletion without constantly returning to it. The practical applications of understanding the Zynic effect are powerful. If you're struggling to start something, you can trick your brain by initiating just a tiny part of the task. Open the spreadsheet and fill in one row, write a single sentence, wash one plate. Once you've started, the mental loop begins to work in your favor. Another strategy is to deliberately break large projects into smaller unfinished pieces, so you're constantly moving forward without feeling paralyzed by the scope of the whole. For those prone to mental overload, externalizing tasks onto a list is surprisingly effective. When you carry all your unfinished business in your head, your brain treats every one of those items as an open loop, holding them in working memory and draining mental resources. Writing them down, even without completing them, gives the brain a symbolic form of closure, freeing up mental bandwidth. But awareness of the Zynic effect also makes you more resistant to manipulation. Once you recognize how often media, marketing, and even casual conversations use open loops to hold your attention, you can pause and decide whether you really want to follow the trail. Sometimes closure isn't worth the bait. For example, not every cliffhanger article online contains valuable information. It might just be exploiting your cognitive wiring to harvest clicks. In relationships, being aware of the effect can help you address tensions directly instead of letting them spiral into long-term resentment. It's tempting to leave a disagreement hanging because it feels awkward to resolve it, but the mental loop it creates will quietly sap emotional energy until it's addressed. In professional settings, managers can use this knowledge constructively by creating a sense of progress rather than overwhelming teams with finished deliverables from the outset. Giving people an open loop, like a partially completed plan or a prototype in need of feedback, can spark engagement and ownership. The Zynic effect, then, is a double-edged sword. On one side, it's a motivational engine that can push us to complete work, seek knowledge, and resolve conflicts. On the other, it can trap us in cycles of anxiety, overthinking, and manipulation by those who know how to tug its strings. The difference lies in whether we are controlling the loop or letting the loop control us. The next time you find yourself lying in bed replaying an unfinished conversation, or halfway through a book you suddenly can't stop thinking about, pause and ask, is this loop serving me, or am I serving it? By harnessing it intentionally, starting before we're ready, segmenting tasks, seeking closure where it matters, and ignoring bait where it doesn't, we can transform the Zynic effect from a mental trap into a tool for focus and fulfillment. And perhaps the most powerful takeaway is this: your brain isn't trying to annoy you with that lingering unfinished thought. It's trying to help you finish what you started. The key is knowing which threads are worth tying off, and which can be left to unravel without regret. The silent treatment: how emotional withholding becomes a weapon of control. The silent treatment: how emotional withholding becomes a weapon of control. Among the many subtle tools of psychological manipulation, few are as insidious yet deceptively simple as the silent treatment. On the surface, it may look like nothing more than someone refusing to speak. but beneath that quiet exterior lies a calculated power play designed to destabilize, control, and subdue its target. At its core, the silent treatment weaponizes one of the most fundamental human needs, the need for connection, acknowledgement, and emotional reciprocity. When communication is deliberately withheld, it doesn't just remove words from a conversation. It removes validation, belonging, and the sense of being seen. For the recipient, this absence can be as psychologically jarring as physical pain, a fact supported by neuroscience research showing that social rejection activates the same brain regions that process bodily injury. While healthy silence exists in relationships, moments where people step back to reflect, cool down, or avoid saying something regrettable, manipulative silence is different in intent and outcome. In healthy scenarios, silence is an act of care, creating space for both parties to think and heal. In toxic scenarios, silence becomes a calculated void, engineered to create confusion, guilt, and desperation for resolution. The manipulator's aim is not to solve the problem, but to make the other person so uncomfortable with the absence of communication that they will do almost anything to restore it, often at the cost of their dignity or boundaries. This tactic thrives in environments where emotional dependence has been cultivated. In romantic relationships where one partner uses silence after disagreements to force the other into apologizing, even when they've done nothing wrong. In families where a parent's withdrawal of affection and acknowledgement is a form of punishment for non-compliance. In workplaces where a superior isolates an employee by ignoring their contributions or existence, eroding their confidence and sense of belonging. Over time, this manipulation creates a psychological conditioning loop. Each episode of silence reinforces the message that the only way to avoid emotional exile is to conform, appease, and avoid confrontation. The targeted individual begins to monitor their words and actions with hypervigilance, afraid of triggering another period of cold dismissal. This is why the silent treatment can be so damaging. It doesn't just control behavior in the moment, it rewires the target's self-concept, making them believe they are perpetually on the verge of being undeserving of attention. Psychologically, the sudden withdrawal of interaction taps into what is often described as an attachment panic, a fear response rooted in our evolutionary need for social bonds. From a neurological perspective, the brain interprets the silence as a threat to survival, flooding the body with stress hormones, amplifying anxiety, and making rational thought more difficult. This heightened emotional state is the manipulator's playground because it weakens the target's ability to think critically and strengthens their impulse to repair the perceived rupture at any cost. Unlike more overt forms of abuse, the silent treatment leaves no visible scars, which makes it harder for outsiders to identify and for victims to justify their feelings. Those subjected to it often second-guess their own perceptions, wondering if they're overreacting or imagining the cruelty. This self-doubt is, in fact, part of the tactic's power. By making the harm seem invisible, it makes the victim less likely to seek support or resist. From a strategic standpoint, silence as manipulation has the advantage of plausible deniability. The manipulator can always claim they just needed space, that they were busy, or that the other person is too sensitive. These excuses muddy the waters, making it harder for the target to call out the abuse without feeling petty or unreasonable. In relationships, this dynamic can turn into a cycle where the target internalizes blame, becomes more compliant, and loses their sense of individuality over time. In extreme cases, prolonged exposure to this tactic can contribute to depression, learned helplessness, and chronic anxiety disorders. So how does one break free from the grip of the silent treatment? The first step is to name it for what it is, a deliberate form of emotional manipulation. Recognizing intent is crucial because it reframes the silence from being a reflection of your worth to being a strategy used against you. The second step is resisting the instinct to chase after the manipulator for reassurance. This can be excruciating, as the natural impulse is to close the gap and regain connection, but giving in to that impulse reinforces the manipulator's power. Instead, focus on maintaining your own emotional equilibrium, setting boundaries, and making it clear, verbally or through consistent action, that communication is a non-negotiable part of any relationship you will engage in. If the person continues to withhold interaction as a weapon, consider reducing your exposure to them. This doesn't always mean cutting them out completely, though that may be necessary in certain cases. It can also mean shifting your emotional investment toward relationships and environments where open, respectful dialogue is valued and practiced. The key is to remember that silence only has power over you if you give it meaning. By refusing to interpret the absence of words as a verdict on your worth, you strip the tactic of its intended impact. That doesn't mean the experience becomes pleasant. Rejection in any form is painful, but it does mean you can respond with self-respect rather than submission. In some cases, especially in professional or family settings where walking away entirely may not be possible, the strategy may involve emotionally detaching from the manipulator's behavior, treating their silence as a reflection of their own emotional immaturity rather than as an indictment of you. Over time, consistently refusing to reward the silent treatment with compliance or guilt can shift the power dynamic, even if it doesn't change the manipulator's behavior. It is worth noting that not all silences are manipulative. Context matters. If someone communicates that they need time to process, and the silence comes with an understanding of mutual respect and eventual reconnection, that is healthy. The danger lies in silence that is sprung without explanation, used to provoke uncertainty, and prolonged until the target bends. The difference is intent, and learning to discern it is one of the most important tools in protecting yourself from covert emotional control. Ultimately, breaking free from the silent treatment is about reclaiming your agency in communication. Words are not the only way we connect, but their absence can speak volumes about a person's motives. The moment you stop letting silence dictate your sense of self, you take away the manipulator's most powerful weapon. In this way, resisting the silent treatment is less about forcing the other person to speak and more about refusing to let their silence speak for you. Gaslighting, the subtle art of making you doubt your reality. Gaslighting is more than just a manipulative tactic. It's a slow, deliberate erosion of a person's confidence in their own memory, perception, and even sanity. While the term comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, where a husband subtly alters the environment to make his wife question her mind, the real-life application is far more common and dangerous. Modern gaslighting thrives in toxic relationships, controlling workplaces, and even in politics, precisely because it exploits the natural human tendency to question oneself when presented with consistent opposition. The manipulator's primary weapon is narrative control, shifting goalposts, denying facts, and reframing events so the victim begins to think their recollection is flawed. Over time, these small distortions accumulate, leaving the target dependent on the abuser's version of reality. For example, a partner might claim, "That never happened," when confronted about a hurtful remark, or a boss might insist, "You must have misunderstood the instructions," despite clear evidence to the contrary. What makes gaslighting so insidious is that it often begins subtly. So subtly, in fact, that victims may not realize it's happening until their sense of certainty has already been deeply undermined. The tactic works best in isolation. Skilled gaslighters understand that if they can cut their target off from external validation, by saying, "No one else would believe you," or portraying him as overly emotional, then the victim will cling to the manipulator for stability, even as they're the one causing the instability. This is why victims often feel trapped, without being physically restrained. The mental cage is far more effective than any lock. Beyond personal relationships, gaslighting is a tool used in the corporate world to deflect responsibility and shift blame. A manipulative manager might deny setting a specific deadline, then later criticize an employee for missing it, creating a no-win situation. In politics, leaders may deny documented events, rewrite historical facts, or blatantly contradict their own statements, all to plant seeds of doubt in the public's collective memory. This mass-scale gaslighting not only confuses people but also encourages passivity. If reality itself feels uncertain, action becomes harder to justify. Psychologically, gaslighting works by exploiting the brain's reliance on self-consistency. We assume our perceptions are generally accurate, but repeated contradictions from someone we trust can override that confidence. Over time, The victim's mental energy shifts from assessing the truth to appeasing the manipulator. The long-term effects can include chronic self-doubt, anxiety, depression, and even memory distortion, as the victim's mind unconsciously rewrites events to align with the false narrative they've been fed. Protecting yourself from gaslighting starts with awareness. The moment you notice patterns of denial, contradiction, or blame shifting, begin documenting conversations, whether through messages, emails, or a personal journal. This provides a tangible record to counter the manipulator's false claims. Speaking to trusted friends, mentors, or therapists can also help ground your perspective, because isolation is the gaslighter's greatest ally. Setting firm boundaries is essential. Refuse to debate objective reality with someone who repeatedly twists it. Instead, assert your observations clearly and disengage from the manipulative dynamic when possible. If walking away physically isn't an option, then mentally detaching from the manipulator's approval can weaken their grip. Rebuilding self-trust takes time, especially if the gaslighting has been ongoing for months or years, but every instance where you validate your own experience chips away at their influence. The real danger of gaslighting lies in how quietly it operates. There are no raised voices or visible chains, just a gradual rewriting of your inner truth until you barely recognize your own thoughts. By understanding how it works and committing to protect your perception, you not only defend yourself, but also send a clear message. Your reality is yours to own, not theirs to rewrite. Social proof exploitation. How popularity becomes a manipulator's tool. Social proof exploitation is the deliberate use of our tendency to follow the crowd as a way to steer decisions, beliefs, and actions without directly forcing them. At its core, social proof is not inherently bad. It's a shortcut the brain uses to navigate uncertainty. When we see others behaving a certain way, we assume they must know something we don't, and we feel safer mirroring them. This worked well in our evolutionary past. If the entire village ran from the riverbank, you didn't pause to investigate. You ran too, because hesitation might have been fatal. In modern life, though, this instinct can be hijacked to bypass critical thinking. We assume a restaurant with a long queue must have great food, that a book with thousands of reviews must be worth reading, or that an opinion repeated endlessly in our social feed must be true. The problem is that what appears to be mass approval can be engineered, staged, or entirely fabricated. Businesses, political campaigns, and even individuals can create the illusion of popularity to exploit this reflex, making us act without examining whether the crowd's direction is worth following. In marketing, the exploitation is blatant. Fake testimonials, purchased reviews, inflated follower counts, and carefully framed bestseller tags are all meant to make you feel like you're late to the party everyone else is already enjoying. Streaming services promote top 10 inches lists that can be influenced by their own marketing priorities, not organic audience choice. Influencers post about products not because they use them, but because they're paid to do so, though the sponsorship is often disguised in a way that makes the endorsement seem spontaneous. Even something as simple as showing 42 people are viewing this right now, or only 3 left, and 27 people have it in their cart, can create a sense that demand is sky high, making hesitation feel foolish. These aren't just numbers. They're cues designed to collapse your decision-making window by making you believe that if you don't act now, the collective will sweep the opportunity away. High-pressure sales tactics take it further. A real estate agent might say, "We've already had multiple offers today," when there haven't been any. Or a car salesperson might claim, "Most customers buy after their first test drive," to subtly imply you'd be unusual or indecisive if you didn't follow suit. This appeal to belonging, framed as what most people do, makes rejecting the offer feel like you're rejecting the norms of the group. Beyond commerce, social proof exploitation is a weapon in politics, activism, and media influence. Repetition of a message across multiple platforms can make it feel universally accepted, even when it's contested or outright false. Propaganda thrives on this. Rally crowds are packed with supporters to convey unstoppable momentum. Headlines repeat the same talking points to create the illusion of consensus, and celebrities or authority figures lend their voices to reinforce the sense that dissent is rare. This taps into our social wiring. If we believe everyone supports an idea, challenging it feels socially risky, even if our private doubts remain. In workplaces, groupthink operates on similar principles. When a problematic policy or unethical practice is widely tolerated, newcomers quickly learn not to speak up because this is just how things are done here. The fear of being the only one to object is a powerful silencer. In personal relationships, manipulative partners or friends may say, "Everyone thinks you're overreacting," to undermine your perspective, making you doubt your own feelings simply because you're told others don't share them. Even in casual social settings, if nobody objects to a questionable joke or remark, people assume it must be acceptable, allowing harmful norms to persist unchallenged. The danger of this manipulation lies in how invisible it feels. Social proof bypasses conscious reasoning because it's anchored in the ancient belief that many people can't be wrong. But history shows that crowds can be very wrong, on matters of justice, truth, and morality. Witch hunts, discriminatory laws, mass investment bubbles, and viral misinformation all thrived because they seemed widely accepted at the time. The more we see something, the truer it feels, regardless of its factual accuracy. That's why misinformation campaigns don't just spread lies, they repeat them relentlessly until the repetition itself becomes persuasive. Protecting yourself from social proof exploitation starts with noticing the emotional signals it triggers. When you feel an urge to conform because everyone else is doing it, pause and ask, is the popularity genuine, and even if it is, does it make the choice right for me? Verify claims from independent sources. Check whether reviews are authentic, whether statistics come from credible data, and whether trending topics have organic origins or are promoted by an agenda. Remind yourself that visibility is not the same as value, and that the majority opinion is not automatically the most accurate one. In social situations, be willing to be the first voice of dissent. Often, others share your doubts but remain silent because they think they're alone in them. By resisting the pull of engineered consensus, you not only protect your own judgment but also make space for real discussion instead of mass imitation. The ability to pause before joining the crowd is not about contrarianism, it's about reclaiming your autonomy in an environment where popularity can be staged as easily as a photo shoot. The crowd might be running towards safety, or it might be running off a cliff. The only way to know is to step aside long enough to see where it's actually going. Understanding how social proof can be weaponized doesn't mean rejecting collective wisdom altogether. It means learning to separate genuine shared insight from the smoke and mirrors of manufactured consensus. In a world where influence can be bought, bots can amplify voices, and appearances can be faked, the skill of independent evaluation becomes more than just a virtue. It's a survival tool for the mind. The hidden power of the fear then relief manipulation tactic. The hidden power of the fear then relief manipulation tactic lies in how skillfully it exploits our most primal survival instincts, turning the natural human response to danger into a moment of extreme vulnerability that can be weaponized for control. At its core, this method operates on a simple but potent psychological rhythm. First, the manipulator triggers an intense emotional state of fear, anxiety, or stress, something that commands your attention entirely and makes your body flood with adrenaline. Then, at a carefully chosen moment, they remove the perceived threat or provide a way out, causing an immediate surge of relief. This emotional whiplash doesn't just feel intense. It places the target into a mental state where they are more likely to accept suggestions, agree to requests, or comply with demands they might otherwise resist. It's not magic, but it is neuroscience. When the brain detects danger, the amygdala takes over, narrowing your focus to the perceived threat and pushing logical reasoning to the background. In this mode, all that matters is escaping discomfort. Relief after fear feels disproportionately good because it signals to the brain that the threat has passed, allowing a flood of calming chemicals to wash over the nervous system. This biochemical shift is intoxicating, and in the moments after it happens, your mental guard is at its lowest. That's when the manipulator strikes. We see this technique in many arenas of life, often without realizing it. In law enforcement, an interrogation may begin with accusations, raised voices, and suggestions of severe consequences. The suspect's mind races with worst-case scenarios: prison, public shame, a ruined life. Just when the pressure becomes unbearable, the interrogator changes tone, offering kindness or reassurance, perhaps even a drink of water. That sudden shift from predator to protector causes the suspect's defensive walls to crumble, and they may confess or agree to a deal simply because their brain clings to the source of relief. The tragic truth is that this vulnerability can push even innocent people to admit to things they didn't do, all to preserve the feeling of safety. Scammers have long understood this tactic as well. A common phone scam begins with a caller posing as an IRS agent, a bank officer, or a government representative. Their opening lines are designed to jolt the victim into panic. You owe thousands in unpaid taxes, or your bank account has been compromised. The victim's body reacts instantly: racing heart, sweaty palms, shallow breathing. The scammer lets the fear build just long enough before offering the escape hatch. If you act now and pay this fee, we can clear the issue. In that moment of relief, critical thinking evaporates, and the victim, grateful for the solution, complies without stopping to question the legitimacy of the threat. In sales and marketing, the fear then relief rhythm is often dressed up in more polished language, but the principle is the same. An insurance agent might paint vivid worst-case scenarios: your house burning down, your family left unprotected, your savings wiped out, until the client is quietly tense. Then, with a smile, they pivot: but if you sign today, you'll have full coverage. That relief becomes the emotional hook that closes the deal. Similarly, limited time offers, and only a few spots left campaigns create a subtle panic about missing out, followed by the comforting reassurance that acting now solves the problem. In manipulative relationships, the tactic often takes a more personal and damaging form. A toxic partner may start a conflict, instill guilt, or hint that the relationship could end. The other person feels distressed, fearing loss or rejection. Then, the abuser changes tone, embracing him, saying, "I just love you so much, I don't want to fight." The partner feels such overwhelming relief at the reconciliation that they overlook the harm that was just done, unknowingly reinforcing the abuser's cycle of control. Even workplaces aren't immune to this pattern. A manager might imply that an employee's job is at risk or that their performance is under scrutiny. The anxiety builds until, suddenly, the manager offers a path to save the situation, often involving unpaid overtime, extra tasks, or personal sacrifices. The worker agrees out of gratitude and relief, unaware that they've been manipulated into overextending themselves. What makes fear then relief so potent is not just the emotional manipulation, but how predictable the human nervous system is under stress. Fear creates tunnel vision, pushing us toward immediate resolution rather than long-term consideration. When the relief hits, the brain mistakes the manipulator for a savior, even if they were the one who caused the distress. This blurring of threat and rescuer roles is why victims often describe feeling grateful to someone who has just exploited them. To defend against this tactic, the first step is awareness. Recognize the signs of artificially induced fear, especially when it comes paired with an unusually convenient solution. If you notice a sudden spike in anxiety or urgency, ask yourself, is this threat real? And why is the person presenting the problem also offering the fix? Manipulators rely on speed, knowing that quick decisions favor their agenda. Slow the interaction down, take a deep breath, step away if possible, and give your rational mind a chance to re-engage. This pause interrupts the fear relief cycle before it can be used against you. Another useful defense is to separate the problem from the solution in your mind. Even if a threat is legitimate, you are not obligated to accept the first escape route presented to you. Alternatives almost always exist, and taking the time to seek them out puts you back in control. In some situations, such as scams, this pause alone is enough to reveal the deception. When you call the bank directly or check official records, you discover there was never any threat at all. Understanding this tactic is empowering because it not only helps you protect yourself, but also allows you to recognize when others may be under its spell. Whether it's a friend being pressured into a bad purchase, a family member manipulated in a relationship, or a coworker coerced into unfair treatment, spotting the fear then relief pattern gives you the chance to intervene. Knowledge is the antidote to emotional hijacking. The more you practice identifying these patterns, the harder it becomes for someone to use them against you. In the end, the fear then relief trick is not just a manipulator's tool. It's a mirror showing how deeply our emotions guide our decisions. By learning to slow down, question our feelings, and reclaim our focus, we transform moments of vulnerability into moments of clarity. And once you can see the tactic for what it is, it loses its grip on you entirely. The Pygmalion effect: how belief shapes performance. The Pygmalion effect is a fascinating psychological principle that demonstrates how expectations, both our own and those placed upon us, can dramatically shape performance and outcomes. It takes its name from the Greek myth of Pygmalion, a sculptor who so deeply believed in the beauty of his creation that it was brought to life, symbolizing the idea that belief itself can transform reality. In modern psychology, the term refers to the way people tend to live up to the standards others set for them when those standards are high, because those expectations subtly influence behavior, effort, and self-perception. One of the most famous demonstrations of this principle came from the research of Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson, who told teachers that certain students had been identified as likely to experience a significant leap in academic achievement. The truth was that the high potential students were selected at random, yet by the end of the year, they showed real academic gains. The explanation was that teachers, believing these students were special, unconsciously gave them more encouragement, challenging work, and positive reinforcement, leading to genuine improvement. I've seen this same pattern play out far beyond classrooms. When a manager views an employee as talented and full of promise, they tend to entrust them with more important projects, give them richer feedback, and offer more opportunities to lead. This increased investment often results in higher confidence and better performance, reinforcing the original belief. Coaches do it with athletes, pushing them harder because they believe they can handle it. Parents do it with children, cultivating resilience and capability through steady faith in their abilities. Even in friendships and romantic relationships, when we treat someone as intelligent, capable, and worthy, they often grow into that role. However, this effect has a dark mirror, the golem effect, in which low expectations become self-fulfilling prophecies of underachievement. A teacher who assumes a student is less capable may give them fewer challenges, less feedback, and less patience, and the student, receiving minimal stimulation, will often perform worse. A supervisor who quietly doubts an employee's abilities may pass him over for stretch assignments, stunting growth and reinforcing mediocrity. This dynamic can trap people in cycles of stagnation not because of their actual potential, but because of the narrow lens through which others see them. The implications are profound. Expectations don't just predict outcomes, they can create them. This means that the words we choose, the opportunities we give, and even the subtle cues in our tone and body language can either build someone up or quietly erode their belief in themselves. On a personal level, the Pygmalion effect is why positive self-talk, visualization, and goal setting are more than just motivational slogans. They're tools for programming your own expectations and nudging your actions towards success. Tell yourself you're capable, act as though that's true, and you'll tend to seek out and persist in the kinds of opportunities that prove it right. But awareness is also a shield, because the same mechanism can be misused. Some managers, leaders, or even partners may deliberately use inflated praise or high expectations not to help you grow, but to extract more work, loyalty, or emotional investment. An employer might say, "We see leadership potential in you," as a way to keep you striving harder without ever offering a promotion. In a manipulative relationship, someone might insist, "You could be so much more if you just tried harder," using the illusion of belief to push you into constant proving mode. That's why setting and receiving expectations should be paired with real support, resources, feedback, and follow through that match the encouragement. High expectations without substance can become a form of exploitation. High expectations with genuine investment can become rocket fuel for achievement. On a societal scale, the Pygmalion effect can shape whole communities. When certain groups are consistently viewed and treated as high achieving, they often fulfill that narrative. When others are labeled as low potential, they may internalize those limits. This is why representation, mentorship, and access to opportunities are so critical, because the way society frames your potential can subtly set the stage for what you believe you can accomplish. To use the Pygmalion effect positively, start by recognizing the influence you have on those around you. When you expect excellence, communicate it sincerely, and back it with the tools to make it possible. You not only help people rise to the occasion, you help them rewrite their self-image. Likewise, set high but realistic expectations for yourself, then commit to the consistent actions that bring them within reach. And remain vigilant for situations where others may be using this principle to serve their own ends at your expense. Ultimately, the Pygmalion effect is a reminder that belief, genuine, consistent, and supported, has the power to bring out the best in people. It can inspire a student to aim higher, an employee to exceed their own benchmarks, a team to achieve the improbable, or even an individual to transform their own life. Like Pygmalion's statue, the image of who we can become takes shape first in imagination and expectation, and with the right encouragement, it can step fully into reality.